As we begin the time of the kings and the prophets, it's good to look back and remember how this family was made. From the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, God established that He is with everyone who trusts in Him. God defined His covenant relationship with humankind, saying, "If you remain with me, I will remain with you. But if you reject me, I will let you, but I will still love you." Through Moses, God rescued His people out of bondage, and with Joshua, He brought them into the land that He had promised. After Joshua was the time of the judges, and they are remembered as everyone doing right in their own eyes. And as a nation, God's people began the slow process of rejecting Him. And so God raised up another prophet, Samuel, and it was through him that this nation officially rejected God and demanded a king. And so Saul was the first man to be established on the throne of Israel. Though he started strong, he finished poorly and did what was right in his own eye. And so God established a new king, David. David would worship God alone, he would rid Israel of all its idolatry, and he would remain faithful to the covenant promise that God had made. Up to this point, the 12 tribes of Israel represented one nation. The mantle of king passed to David's son Solomon, who worshipped God, but by the end of his life, he represented the Pharaoh of Egypt more than he did his father David. And so, at the end of Solomon's life, many of the tribes of Israel were so embittered that a civil war broke out. 10 out of the 12 tribes kept the name Israel and formed a nation to the north, while the remaining 2 tribes formed Judah in the south. The 10 tribes to the north, Israel, would remain a nation for around 300 years and go through 19 kings. In the south, the 2 tribes that formed Judah would go through around 20 kings and last for about 450 years. As we remember the covenant relationship that God established with His people, He was looking for people who would worship Him alone, they would rid Israel from all idolatry, and they would remain faithful to God's covenant promise. Out of the 19 kings that led Israel to the north, not one of them followed any of these. They all did evil in the sight of the Lord. And in 722 BC, the capital city of Samaria was conquered by the Assyrian kingdom, and these 10 tribes were exiled and would never become a kingdom again. While no king to the north descended from David, every single one of Judah's kings came from David's line. While God remained faithful to Israel and His covenant promises, and invited the kings of Judah to also remain faithful, only 8 out of the 20 kings did what was right in God's eyes. David's 12 ancestors, who did evil in the Lord's sight, broke the covenant with God and led the nation so astray that by 586 BC, the Babylonian Empire came and destroyed the capital city, Jerusalem, and the Jews of Judah were taken into exile. As we get the picture that both Israel and Judah are getting further and further away from God's covenant, now is the time for the prophets to enter. The prophets are God's covenant watchdogs, and they give warning after warning to worship God alone and to remain faithful in relationship with God and one another. And so we see the existence of prophets come throughout Israel as well as Judah. The further the kings push the nation away from God, the more relevant the message of the prophet becomes. As we learn to read our Bibles, it is important to identify each prophet, the king they are speaking to, and the nation who needs to be reminded that God is waiting for His people while following God's king to turn back to Him so He can redeem their covenant relationship.